Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Tracy Gill. Today and for all Tuesdays through June 11th, I am co-hosting a seminar series with Gyami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office. Gyami will provide background for the series and introduce the seminar and speaker. But before she does, here are some webinar logistics and related information. The presenter today is fine with clarifying questions during the seminar. Go ahead and type them into the chat box and she'll get to them when she can. And if you are interested in getting a PDF copy or recording of today's presentation, we will list relevant websites in the chat box where you can find them later, as well as links to the chapters of the SOCCR2 reports. Or you can contact me, Tracy Gill, or Gyami Shrestha, and we will be happy to help you. If you are not on NOAA's weekly science seminar list, but would like to be, please email me at tracy.gill@noaa.gov and I will add you to the list. And now I will hand it over to Gyami Shrestha to introduce the seminar title and speaker. Gyami?
Thank you, Tracy. Greetings, everyone. I am Gyami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office in Washington, D.C. I have been leading this carbon seminar series with Tracy Gill from NOAA since February. Before today's seminar, I would like to first express my gratitude to NOAA and Tracy Gill, as well as all webinar speakers and participants, for making this 16-week seminar series possible. Today's seminar or webinar is the 14th in a 16-part series titled From Science to Solutions, the State of the Carbon Cycle, which is focused on disseminating the second state of the carbon cycle science report findings in relation to current and broader societal impacts and solutions. For your reference, the recordings of prior webinars in this series are available on the YouTube channel of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program. All pertinent slides and details of the webinar series are available on the program website, carboncyclescience.us. This webinar series is sponsored by the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program in partnership with NOAA. The U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program is an interagency partnership led by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group since 1999. We coordinate and facilitate federally funded carbon cycle research with the science community, and we provide leadership to the U.S. Global Change Research Program on interagency carbon cycle science priorities and activities. For instance, we led the 3-year effort to develop the second state of the carbon cycle report with over 200 experts from the US, Canada, Mexico, and other nations. This decadal assessment underwent a 6-step formal multi-draft peer review by multiple US and international experts, the US National Academy of Sciences, the public, and 13 federal agencies and departments before its release on November 23, 2018. On the occasion of Earth Day, the U.S. Global Change Research Program released a new metadata-embedded website for this special assessment, carbon2018.globalchange.gov. This website offers enhanced search capabilities as well as content graphics and tables that are easily accessible to both general and scientific stakeholders. During today's webinar, Dr. Deborah Huntzinger, or Debbie Huntzinger as we call her, will talk about the future of the North American carbon cycle, focusing on one of the chapters of this special assessment that she co-led with Dr. Abhishek Chatterjee. First, here is some background on Dr. Debbie Huntzinger. Dr. Debbie Huntzinger is an associate professor of climate science at Northern Arizona University. Her expertise lies in modeling complex environmental systems and the development of methods to evaluate and compare model estimates. Her work in sustainability and climate has included carbon cycle dynamics in terrestrial ecosystems, carbon sequestration in industrial waste byproducts, and groundwater modeling in a socially and ecologically important watershed. Much of Dr. Huntzinger's current research interests are in advancing the understanding of the land carbon cycle's interactions and feedbacks with Earth's changing climate. Dr. Huntzinger was one of the core investigators in the North American Carbon Program Regional Interim Synthesis Project and is the lead investigator of the North American Carbon Program Multiscale Synthesis and Terrestrial Model Intercomparison Project, or MISTI-MIP. I have personally known Dr. Debbie Huntzinger since I joined the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office in 2011. We have worked together on some major community engagement activities, including the 4th North American Carbon Program All Investigators Meeting that she co-chaired a few years ago. Dr. Huntzinger was and is the co-lead of Chapter 19 in the State of the Carbon Cycle report with Dr. Abhishek Chatterjee from NASA and USRA. It has been a pleasure working with both Debbie and Abhishek over the last few years. Welcome, Debbie and co-author Abhishek Chatterjee, and thanks for presenting your work today. Debbie?
Hey, can you guys hear me? I unmuted, so hopefully everyone can hear me. All right, yes. Tammy says yes. All right, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, Yami and Tracy. I'm going to be presenting the results from this chapter, but it is work from myself and Abhishek, my co-lead, as well as a number of participating authors, which I'll acknowledge at the end. If you have questions while I am going through these slides, please type them in the chat box, and I will try to keep looking there to see if anybody posts a question, and I'll try to address it. Abhishek is also on the line, and hopefully he can help address questions later on as well. So I'm going to start with a bit of context. So the land and the oceans are extremely important for controlling or regulating the amount of carbon dioxide that accumulates in the atmosphere. And the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is a prime driver to the current and past changes in climate that we've seen. Globally, the major sources of carbon to the atmosphere are fossil fuel burning and land use changes, like activities like deforestation. And of the 11 or so petagrams of carbon put into the atmosphere annually, a little less than half of that, or 50%, remains in the atmosphere. And the rest is taken up and stored by the terrestrial biosphere in the oceans. So the land and the oceans are providing an enormous benefit by mitigating or reducing the amount of carbon accumulating in the atmosphere, and thus slowing the rate of climate warming. If we look at the current carbon budget for North America reported in the second chapter of the SOCCR2 report, we see a more nuanced picture of this budget, this carbon budget, with additional flows of carbon to and from the atmosphere, including from product-related emissions and estuaries and tidal lands, or tidal wetlands. We also have or see in this picture lateral flows of carbon from some pools, like between land ecosystems and inland and ocean waters. But if we focus in on the two of these major fluxes, we see that just like in that global carbon budget, within North America, both the natural, land, and ocean systems are a net sink of carbon to the atmosphere. In other words, they take in and store more carbon per year than they release. And by taking up atmospheric CO2, both the land and the oceans play a critical role in slowing the buildup of carbon to the atmosphere, and thereby slowing that rate of climate warming. And therefore, a central question for researchers has been and continues to be, will the land and the oceans continue to provide this service into the future, or will the ocean and land carbon sinks decrease in strength or potentially switch to a source of carbon to the atmosphere under changing and even unprecedented environmental conditions? In other words, can we fill in for the future values in each of these components that we saw earlier, or at least some of the major ones? Predicting future carbon cycle changes, however, requires the ability to estimate the response of both land and aquatic systems to a number of often competing drivers. And so if we think about an example focused on land ecosystems for now, things like CO2 fertilization, or the idea that CO2 acts as plant food, as well as nitrogen and nutrient deposition from the atmosphere, forest regrowth, warming of high latitudes, and an increase in growing season length can all contribute to an increased terrestrial sink or an increase in carbon storage in the terrestrial biosphere from the atmosphere. Whereas things like drought, the conversion of forest to agriculture, emerging nitrogen and phosphorus limitations can all act to constrain terrestrial carbon uptake. And it's the balance of these competing and interacting factors that is complex and unknown, and yet it determines whether the terrestrial biosphere will serve as a net sink or a source of carbon to the atmosphere into the future. So in this talk, I will review the current understanding of potential changes in the North American carbon cycle as reported in Chapter 19 of the SOCCR2 report that I myself and Abhishek Chatterjee co-authored or co-led. I will focus on the major drivers of future changes in the carbon cycle, discuss what we know or can predict about the land and coastal ocean response to these drivers, and highlight some of the major knowledge gaps that require further research. Most of the work examining future carbon cycle changes has been done at the global scale. And so we provide projections specific to North American carbon cycle changes where possible. And in some cases, we have to draw from global scale projections and focus those on North American changes. And I'll just point out that this type of chapter or focused examination on future carbon cycle changes is new to SOCCR, and it wasn't in the first SOCCR assessment report, at least in its own chapter. So let's start in with the major drivers of future change. So fossil fuels are vital to North American energy needs, and emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels in North America's energy sector are currently a source of carbon to the atmosphere and will continue to be a source into the future. Projections suggest that by the year 2050, so the middle of the century, total North American fossil fuel emissions will range from just over 1,500 teragrams carbon to almost 1,800 teragrams carbon. And if you compare this to 2015 levels, this is either an increase of about 2.8% or a decrease in 3% in terms of absolute emissions. These estimates are based on a range of projections for each country in North America, so Canada, US, and Mexico, and provide a high and a low bounds for potential emissions from fossil fuel burning based on current technologies and projected use of fuels and current technologies. There are, of course, uncertainties in these estimates based on difficult to predict factors such as future energy policies, developments in technologies and demographics, energy prices, economic growth, and other factors. Land use and land cover change are also a driver to North American carbon cycle changes. Here, land cover refers to the observed physical and biological land cover on Earth's surface, whereas land use refers to how people use land for shelter, food, fiber, fuel, and so on. How we use land depends on policies, market preferences, and demands for things like agriculture. And so globally, if we think about land use as a driver, land use change is projected to add carbon to the atmosphere through forest or vegetation clearing for agriculture. However, within the United States, future land use activities are projected to take up or sequester carbon from the atmosphere through increased carbon uptake and storage of about 4 petagrams carbon by 2030. To put this in perspective, 4 petagrams carbon is about 4 times the current annual net natural carbon uptake by the terrestrial biosphere. Projected increases in U.S. carbon stocks from land use are primarily driven by regrowth of existing forests, management activities that promote ecosystem carbon uptake, and responses to changes in markets and policies. But the actual amount of carbon uptake attributed to land use change will depend on a number of factors, including environmental conditions, such as water availability, future policies, population, and the demand for agricultural commodities. Climate change in North America is expected to affect carbon cycling in both land and ocean ecosystems. On land, the processes of photosynthesis, respiration by plants, and decomposition in soils strongly depend on temperature and moisture conditions. And in aquatic systems, temperature is a strong control on the solubility of gases in water, and thus affects the rate at which carbon dioxide is exchanged with ocean and freshwater systems. The U.S. has warmed by over 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1901, and temperatures are projected to continue to rise throughout the century, with near-term increases of at least 2.5 degrees Celsius in coming decades, to much larger increases of up to 6 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century under the highest human-driven emissions scenarios. In terms of precipitation, higher latitudes are projected to become wetter and tropical regions drier. The maps here show differences, or the percent change in precipitation between the end of the century, so 2100, and current conditions based on high emission scenarios for different seasons. And these estimates are taken from the Climate Science Special Report that was released around the same time as the SOCCR report. The red stippling on the maps, which is a little bit difficult to see, but you'll see it up in the northern regions there, indicates changes that are large compared to natural variations, while the hashing indicates changes that are small compared to natural variations. So some of these changes are predicted to be significant, while others may not be. Oops, let me go back. Drivers. An additional driver is, in addition to the changes in annual temperature and net precipitation, the frequency and intensity of extreme heat and precipitation events are likely to increase. The top map shows projected mid-century changes, so around 2050, in temperature or mean temperature, or the projected changes in number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit or below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to try to use my pointer here. So above 90 or below 32 degrees Fahrenheit between the middle of the century and now. The bottom map here shows projections in mid and late century changes in extreme precipitation events, so mid-century here and late century here. And you'll notice that in all regions of the United States, the number of extreme heat and precipitation events is likely to increase. Oh, I just got a note that I had it wrong. CSSR was, the Climate Science Special Report was released in 2017, not 2018. I apologize for that. All right. Thanks, Gammy, for clarifying that for me. So now that we've kind of overview of some of the major drivers of future change, what can we say about the land and coastal ocean carbon cycle response to these drivers? So let's start with the land carbon cycle in North America. We know from studying current and past changes in land carbon cycle that it's sensitive to changes in atmospheric composition, particularly the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The land carbon cycle is also sensitive to temperature and precipitation changes, as well as events like prolonged drought and changes in growing season length. Disturbances like forest fire, insect disease outbreak influence carbon uptake, as does how we use the land surface for agriculture and forestry, and the amount and type of nutrients that are available to support plant growth. So the land carbon uptake is projected to increase with increasing amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere, both globally and within North America. The more carbon in the atmosphere, the more food for plants, the more productive plants are, and we term this CO2 fertilization. However, the exact magnitude of terrestrial ecosystem response to increasing atmospheric CO2 is uncertain for a number of reasons. First, the amount of carbon plants take up in response to rising CO2 will depend on the age distribution of trees. So young trees that are accumulating biomass will respond more favorably or fix more carbon in response to rising CO2 than older, more mature trees. Second, nutrients will likely constrain the land carbon cycle's response to rising CO2. So nitrogen is a key nutrient for plant growth, and limited amounts of nitrogen can limit plant growth even when atmospheric CO2 levels are high. And third, the response of soil carbon stocks to rising CO2 is uncertain. Some studies suggest that increased plant uptake of carbon and thus increases in soil carbon input may accelerate the decomposition of soil organic matter. So the increased rates of productivity relate to increased inputs into soil carbon and increased soil carbon turnover. And overall, this would lead to less overall carbon storage in soil pools, but this remains highly uncertain. Carbon losses due to climate warming, however, have the potential to partially offset or negate carbon gains caused by rising atmospheric CO2 conditions. This is primarily driven by increased rates of decomposition of organic matter in soils in a warmer world. However, the magnitude of a warming response is uncertain because of other factors. For example, heat stress on plants can decrease land carbon uptake capacity. Conversely, a lengthened or longer growing season at high latitudes could increase carbon inputs in some regions, and the balance of these competing factors is unclear. Probably one of the biggest concerns is the response of soils to climate warming, particularly soils at high northern latitudes, such as in Alaska or Canada. Globally, soils store more than twice the carbon currently stored in the atmosphere, and warming is making carbon stored in permafrost soils vulnerable to release to the atmosphere. And a large-scale release of carbon from permafrost thaw, could shift some northern regions from a net sink of carbon to a net source of carbon to the atmosphere into the future. When we think about future projections of North American carbon cycle changes, particularly on land, we can examine those changes using simulations from global scale coupled carbon climate models that are forced with 4 different future scenarios, or what we term representative concentration feedbacks. The set of 4 RCPs included here account for different assumptions of emissions, energy consumption, where our energy comes from, is it coal, natural gas, or renewables, technologies, particularly energy technologies, land use change, such as how much land do we employ for cropland and agricultural activities, the type of practices that we use to cultivate that land, population, and other factors. And each RCP is named after its target radiative forcing in the year 2100. So in reality, think about it as the energy imbalance of the Earth system. And we use these model projections based on these RCPs to examine the range of potential land carbon cycle behavior within North America into the future. So this figure shows projected changes in North American land carbon uptake by these different RCP scenarios in the year 2050. And this is the left lighter colored bar for each of those RCP scenarios. And then also in the year 2100, which is the darker right colored bar. So based on these projections, by 2050, models project a slight decrease or doubling in the current land carbon sink strength, depending on emission and land use scenario. By 2100, the strength of the North American land carbon sink is projected to either remain near its current levels or decline significantly. And the uncertainties in these projections comes from the combined effects of atmospheric CO2, climate change, and land use change management, and trying to find the balance of these competing factors. If we shift over to the coastal oceans around North America, first, I think I doubled, yeah, there we go. Globally, coastal oceans account for about 50% of ocean area. I should say it's 41% of ocean area. North America makes up about 10% of global coasts, so 10% of that global coastal area. And here, coastal oceans include some rivers, estuaries, tidal wetlands, and the continental shelf. Like on land, an increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations by itself is projected to increase uptake of carbon by the coastal oceans. This has to do with the partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere. As the concentration of CO2 increases, so does the CO2's partial pressure, meaning that more CO2 is dissolved in the oceans. And as the coastal oceans take up more CO2, the pH of ocean waters bordering North America is projected to decrease by up to a half of a pH unit, or 0.5 pH units, by 2100 under the highest emissions scenarios. A drop in half a pH unit sounds small, but actually equates to an increase in acidity of around 200%. However, into the future, the ability of a warmer, more CO2-enriched ocean water to take up additional CO2 is expected to decrease as the waters become more saturated with respect to CO2, carbon dioxide. Climate warming, on the other hand, is projected to reduce the ability of coastal ocean waters to take up carbon from the atmosphere in most regions of North America. This is because the solubility of CO2, as with other gases, depends on temperature, and the warmer the water, the lower the solubility. Warming can also lead to increased stratification and slower ocean circulation, both of which can lower CO2 uptake capacity and modify patterns of CO2 outgassing from ocean waters along the coast. Climate-driven changes in precipitation may also impact the amount and composition of future river carbon fluxes, and thus then the delivery of carbon to coastal oceans from the terrestrial biosphere. These are those lateral fluxes of carbon that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk when I showed the carbon budget for North America. So overall, what does the carbon budget for North American coastal oceans look like? Well, since 1870 coastal oceans in North America have taken up and stored about 3 petagrams of carbon from the atmosphere. And under the highest emission scenarios, these regions are projected to take up an additional 10 to 12 petagrams carbon by 2050, and another 17 to 26 or so petagrams of carbon between 2050 and 2100. But although the coastal ocean zones may be sinks of carbon, they are heavily influenced by human activities and land processes, so projecting their future behavior can be difficult. And also the combined effects and pressures of climate warming and atmospheric CO2 on ocean carbon cycling are hard to predict, just as they are on land. So trying to sum things up with key takeaways from the chapter in terms of future carbon cycle changes. Primary contributors to carbon cycle change over North America are and will continue to be emissions from fossil fuel combustion, changes in how we use the land surface, so land use change, and changing climatic conditions. Projections from models suggest that natural carbon sinks of North America, including land and coastal ocean systems, are diminishing in strength, and many are at risk into the future. And accelerated warming in northern high latitudes in Alaska and Canada is making large stores of carbon in permafrost soils vulnerable to release to the atmosphere by the end of the century. So what are the major knowledge gaps in the areas that require more research? One crucial area of uncertainty is the magnitude of CO2 fertilization. While models agree on the direction of change, in other words, models agree that increased amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere will lead to enhanced carbon uptake in both land and ocean systems into the future, they disagree on the magnitude of the response. And this is more uncertain in land compared to ocean systems. A lot of this uncertainty has to do with the lack of understanding of carbon-nitrogen coupling and the factors that will modulate or regulate CO2 fertilization response in land ecosystems into the future. A second major knowledge gap is the permafrost carbon feedback at high northern latitudes. Studies suggest that by the end of the century, soil carbon losses due to permafrost thaw will determine the trajectory of the carbon cycle. And while vegetation may help regulate or offset some of these losses through a lengthening of growing season and enhanced carbon uptake by plants, the extent of these benefits is highly uncertain. The major knowledge gaps and research needs in this area include a need for a better understanding of the area and depth of permafrost that's vulnerable to warming, so the release of carbon from permafrost thaw, as well as a better understanding of the rate of carbon released from thawing permafrost. So how fast will these changes happen? And third, improved estimates of the form of carbon release. In other words, is carbon released as carbon dioxide or methane? And this is important because methane has a global warming potential much larger than CO2, so the form of carbon matters here. Other knowledge gaps include the North American carbon cycle response to things like drought, disturbance, and land use change. The general consensus is that the occurrence and severity of disturbances like fire are expected to increase, but the magnitude, timing, and exact impacts of these disturbances are uncertain. Droughts, too, are expected to increase in severity, area of extent, and duration. However, the long-term impacts of drought and vegetation are less well known. And land use and land cover changes are expected to be a significant driver to future carbon cycle changes, as I discussed earlier. But because land use is strongly tied to social and economic trends, the role of land use in the future North American carbon cycle can be difficult to predict, and so more work is needed in this area. Finally, much of the work of projections relies on models, and there are a few key sources of uncertainty in models. The two biggest sources are what we term model uncertainty And this refers to uncertainty in the structure of models themselves. So what processes do models include? How are those processes formulated in the models? What parameterizations do they use for those processes? The second source of error is scenario uncertainty. And this relates to the type of input information that's fed to models in terms of environmental conditions or different future scenarios. The figure here shows projections of cumulative carbon uptake between 2006 and 2100. This is globally. Model uncertainty and scenario uncertainty, as you'll see from these figures, contribute most to the spread in projections by models. However, the relative importance of each driver differs between ocean and land projections. Projections of future ocean carbon cycle changes are dominated by scenario uncertainty, particularly in the long term, out into the future, whereas projections of the land carbon cycle are attributed mostly to model uncertainty. Reducing model uncertainty is important but challenging and requires critically evaluating models against observations. There's a lot of ongoing work in this area, but much more is needed. So that is all I had here for today. I want to acknowledge all of the contributing authors to this chapter, along with the organizers and leaders of the SOCCR2 report. And I am happy to take any questions that you have and address them as best as I can. Hopefully Abhishek can chime in if he has some additional information.
Thank you. Thanks, Debbie. And folks online, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box. And I see Abhishek's typing for us, leaving us a message.
You're welcome, Abhishek.
Got another question coming in. Came and it went.
Yeah.
We'll just wait a little bit. Yeah, people are typing now. Debbie, where'd you get that? Where's that picture from of that beautiful sunset? I'm curious.
That was, I think, a purchase picture that we found online for use in the chapter front page. So it's not one that I took.
It's really nice.
But I liked the bench as it was looking over the mountains as this idea of contemplating the future.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead and read the question first, or.
Okay, so is this Nancy Cavallero who said, can you expand a bit on the model uncertainties for the land sink in the last slide? Which areas or parameters or observations are most uncertain? So in terms of land carbon modeling, it's really challenging because we have a very heterogeneous system in the sense that we have forests next to agriculture, next to urban areas and development, and we have topography changes, and all of those can be difficult to capture in a regional or global scale model. And so there are obviously some simplifying assumptions that modelers have to make in order to model carbon cycle changes over the land surface. And so when we think of sources of uncertainty, all of the complexity in the land carbon cycle would be, capturing all of that complexity in a model would be impossible, in the sense that it would take too much computational effort to actually run the model. And so modelers make choices in terms of what processes they think are most important for controlling carbon cycle changes or changes in land atmosphere carbon exchange, as well as how they formulate those processes mathematically in their model. And so there's differences in how modelers approach this, and that can lead to uncertainty. So that's part of this model uncertainty component. As well as when you formulate a process in a model, you have to give it some parameter values. And and those parameter values are usually drawn from observational studies, and we don't have observational studies everywhere globally. We tend to have them more heavily in temperate ecosystems in North America, for example, than we do in tropical forests or in other parts like, say, Africa or less developed regions. And so all of those factors contribute to uncertainty, the model uncertainty component in the land carbon component. In terms of observations, like I said, we have a very spatially heterogeneous landscape, and it's impossible to also observe or sample that landscape everywhere at all times. And so we tend to use point or site level measurements in combination with satellite observations and aircraft measurements to try to constrain our understanding and thus constrain model estimates. But we're always observational poor, and so the types of observations that we really need are things that look at the sensitivity of the land carbon cycle to these environmental factors. And those are often difficult to get from measurements because they require long-term observational studies that in some cases perturb the landscape by, adding additional CO2 or increasing temperatures at a site and then measuring response over time. And so I think just the more we can try to match up observations with model output and try to get at these responses, these sensitivities of the land carbon cycle to environmental changes, the more we will improve or have likelihood to improve model estimates. I don't know, Abhishek, if you want to cover anything. He's saying there that if you look at the chapter, the box 19.2 in the chapter covers some of this in a little bit more detail. Okay, and I have another question from Robert Graff about policies that might be best for increasing or assuring land carbon uptake. In North America, like I mentioned, in terms of land use change, projections actually suggest that due to land use change activities, we'd see an increased carbon uptake. And there's been some of this focused around these forest carbon offset projects where we can try to promote the management of forested ecosystems to promote carbon uptake and storage. And then one of this is if we promote land management, for example, to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire, that can enhance carbon storage in ecosystems by not making that carbon vulnerable to release from wildfire. Also, there's a lot of work that's being done on agricultural practices. So like, how do we actually cultivate the landscape, and are there different agricultural activities or practices that can promote storage of carbon in soil over the long term? Hopefully they answered some of your question there. But I think it's really, it's policies that place an importance on carbon storage in land systems. And yes, I think they're recording this presentation and making it available, but I'll let Gammy and Tracy point you to where you can find access to that.
Yes, I'll post some links shortly about where those will be in a few days. Thank you.
Yeah, there's so many comments coming in. I'm trying to keep track of them. Yeah. The next one I see here is from Shelley that says, can you explain what is known about anthropogenic nutrient inputs into the ocean versus atmospheric carbon deposition as a causative factors of climate change? I am not an ocean carbon expert, so I don't know if, Abhishek, if you want to try to handle that one in terms of, I know that there's been talk of like seeding the ocean with nutrients, and this idea here is that the more, carbon uptake in both the ocean and the terrestrial biosphere happens through photosynthesis. And in the oceans, there's also dissolving of CO2 into ocean waters. But in terms of the biological uptake, it happens through photosynthesis. And photosynthesis in these ecosystems is often limited by the availability of nutrients. So this idea that if you can provide these systems with more nutrients, then they're able to capture or fix more carbon. And so if you think about this in relationship to atmospheric carbon deposition, it's you can have like CO2 fertilization like increases in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in and of itself don't directly link to increased carbon uptake in land and ocean systems. It depends on the amount of nutrients that are available. And so if nutrients are limiting, then you're going to limit that CO2 fertilization effect in both ecosystems.
Okay.
And then Warren asked, how large are pixels of land surface models area? How can data sets like forest inventories improve models decrease uncertainty in the future? That's a good question. In terms of the projections that I showed from the global scale models, I believe a lot of those models, the exact spatial resolution of the models varies slightly, but those global scale models that I showed earlier, around 2 degrees, is the native resolution of the models, so 2 degrees by 2 degrees. Abhishek, can you help me on the conversion to kilometers from degrees? I'm wanting to say that is it 50 kilometers per degree? Or is it 150? I forget. But anyway, so the grid cells are actually pretty large when you think about it compared to variation at the land surface. And so one of the challenges with using observations to evaluate or validate model estimates is a scale mismatch between the measurements and the models. So the models often have these large grid cells that are hundreds of kilometers on a side, and your site level measurements might only be appropriate for a footprint that's around a kilometer, say, in size. And so Abhishek said a 1 degree grid cell at the equator is about 100 kilometers. Yeah. So we tend to have this scale mismatch between models and observations. And so it can be challenging to use those models to infer whether, or use those observations to infer whether a model is getting a correct answer, because the sampling size of the models is so much larger than the observations sometimes. Forest inventories have been used as a comparison against model estimates, and I think they had some of this in Chapter 2 of the SOCCR report, where they combine different estimates of carbon uptake and loss. And we kind of turn this as like bottom-up and top-down estimates, and both process-based models are bottom-up estimates and inventories are bottom-up estimates, and they're both independent of one another typically, and so they're good to be used to compare against models. It's just that we don't have forest inventory measurements everywhere. We have them in some forests of North America, but not in all regions. And the time scales of those inventories oftentimes are done like every 5 to 10 years, and where models are estimating land carbon exchange on a monthly to annual time basis. I'm just going through the comments here. David Price asks, is there any evidence to suggest that carbon uptake trends in North American coastal waters are significantly different from trends in global oceans? This is a great question, but I'm not sure that I can speak to it. Is there anyone else that can talk to this online that wants to add any comments here? The chapter here focused mostly on coastal and North American regions rather than the open ocean, but there is chapter, Gami, which chapter is ocean focused? And I don't know if they have a broader picture that we could point the participant to.
Would it help to look at that major components of the North American carbon cycle diagram? Yeah. Or no?
I can go back to that one here.
Help exactly, but
I know that they have, and they broke that down in much finer detail than we were able to here. Yeah. So they, in our chapter, we take tidal wetlands, estuaries, and coastal oceans together, whereas here they break them out. But still, there's a transfer of carbon from coastal oceans to open oceans.
Oh, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it's in which chapter would that be? The ocean chapter then, ocean and coastal chapter.
I don't remember which the ocean chapter is number-wise. right off the bat.
We're trying to connect Abhishek to the, see if he wants to speak up. But
He typing everything. Yeah. I'm just scrolling down here. Carlo had a question about carbon emissions from agriculture, soil tillage, biomass burning can be significant. How good are these processes represented in global scale models? To different degrees, it depends on the model. I can't speak to all of the models that were used in the CMIP-5 comparison, which was informing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC report. Some of the models that I've worked with in terms of these land carbon cycle models, they don't tend to represent agricultural processes in that much detail. Some models do have different crop rotations and tillage practices in there. Others do not. They don't even, some models may not even model things as agriculture. They model them rather as grasslands, or they do it rather rudimentarily, like where they just consider two different basic crops, like corn and wheat. And so it varies considerably across models, the detail in which they model agricultural practices. Biomass burning, I'm not sure in terms of how much models, to my knowledge, I don't know if any models directly account for human biomass burning or clearing of forested regions to agricultural lands, unless that's prescribed in their driver data or how they account for changes in land cover over time or land use over time. A large number of models do account for like natural wildfire in their models.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions? We've been trying to get your co-host or your co-author on there, but we should have done a sound check with him beforehand, so I don't know if that's working out very well. Are there any other questions? Oh, Abhishek's typing. Great. Oh, okay. All right. Well, next time we'll know to make sure we have everybody sound checked beforehand. I just didn't know Abhishek was going to speak. Sorry, Abhishek. Okay. Are there any other questions? Debbie, can we go to that last slide again in case people want to contact you or have questions?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any more efficient way to go there besides just clicking on this. But.
Yeah, that's all right. You could use this thing. That's fine.
Yeah. So here's the contact information for both myself and Abhishek. If you have any questions about Chapter 19 specifically, or other chapters in the SOCCR report, we can, if we can't answer them directly, we can point you to the person that might have that information.
Yes, and you can contact Gyami or myself for a copy of the PDF, or Gyami will post these online probably within a few days. Okay. Well, great presentation. Thank you so much, Debbie. And Gyami, do you want to say a few words about the next seminar?
Hi, yeah, sure. And first, thank you so much, Debbie, and also Abhishek. This presentation was I mean, it's so helpful to understand so many of the modeling and scenarios and all basically the projections of North American carbon cycle. It was very, very useful. And thanks, Tracy. So next week, on June 4th, will be the 15th webinar in our series, presented by Dr. Peter Marco-Tullio, who is the director of the Institute for Sustainable Cities at Hunter College in New York. He'll be focusing his presentation on energy. The title of his talk is North American Energy System Contributions to the Global Carbon Cycle. Will the cycle be unbroken? Be an exciting one also. Thank you. Thanks everyone. I hope you can join us next week too.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks again, Debbie and Abhishek. It was a great presentation. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.